Well, US and Iranian negotiators meet in Geneva today for another round of talks on Iran's nuclear program. Donald Trump maintains the regime wants to build a nuclear weapon, but Tehran insists its plans are peaceful. The US president has threatened to launch more strikes on Iran unless there's a deal.
Iran's delegation arriving in Switzerland with the aim of averting fresh conflict with the US. On Tuesday, President Trump had hinted at possible military action against Iran during his State of the Union address in Washington, though his vice president later confirmed that US envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's own son-in-law Jared Kushner would seek to find a peaceful solution during Thursday's talks.
As you know, he is sending two of his best negotiators to Geneva tomorrow in order to continue to try to strike the best deal possible for the American people. But the principle is very simple. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. If they try to rebuild a nuclear weapon, that causes problems for us. And in fact, we've seen evidence that they have tried to do exactly that.
Iran and the US have already held 5 rounds of nuclear talks without reaching an agreement. Ahead of the latest showdown, Iran's foreign minister said his nation's nuclear plans were peaceful.
We are ready to answer questions. We are ready to remove concerns, but we are not ready to give up our right for peaceful use of nuclear technology. This is what we demand. So I believe that tomorrow in Geneva, there is every possibility to come to an agreed solution which is fair and balanced.
These talks come as America assembles its biggest deployment of aircraft and warships to the Middle East in decades. Pressure from Donald Trump to get a deal, while Iran struggles at home with growing dissent after a vicious crackdown on nationwide protests last month.
With me in the studio, Shani Vrazanes, DW's Middle East analyst. Shani, good to see you. Iran and the US are arguing, among other things, over the extent to which Iran is enriching uranium. With the clock ticking, how close are we to a deal?
Well, it seems like at the beginning of this day, as talks are starting, that they're as far as can be from each other. The Americans basically say zero enrichment. The Iranians are saying they're willing to make some compromises. We need to also be very careful with speculation. There's a lot going on in back channels. We don't really know, and we've been hearing everybody's tense. Everybody wants to know, but the fact is we know very little. We do know for a fact the Americans want zero enrichment. The Iranians are sticking to having even low enrichment levels, maybe even agreeing to 3.6%, which is what actually the Americans have already had under the agreement, the JCPOA, that was negotiated under the Obama administration and was then cancelled and withdrawn by Trump. But this is where we are. And I think what we need to understand in the core of these talks that we're seeing is, what do the Americans really want? For Iran, the very fact that they are having talks, and they're stalling and they're still at the table with the Americans, that's already an achievement. They, of course, hope for removal of the sanctions, who's going to help them stabilize the regime. But the Americans, we're not quite sure if they want to remove this Iranian threat of nuclear and then you can maybe find something in the negotiation that will make it work, or do they aim for a bigger goal, which would be the removal of the regime, also removal of the ballistic missiles, or sort of a complete overhaul of the strategic, power dynamics between Iran and the region, in Iran and America. And if they're going for the bigger one, then, of course, these talks are not going to get them there.
On what seems like a path to conflict, do you detect either side making themselves any sort of off-ramp?
Well, the Iranians say they're willing for concessions, and the leaks that we've been hearing are that they're willing to go as low as 3.6% of enrichment. This is, again, what they have already had in the past. For Trump to agree to the deals that the Iranians have already had with them in 2015 would seem like a defeat. But if we're looking for an off-ramp, we need to notice who is there for Trump today. In Geneva, we're talking about Witkoff and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. They're his most close allies. They are also not diplomats, not politicians, very practical, solution-oriented people. They seem to be the least interested in letting this escalate to a war. So maybe their presence there for itself is already a sign that Trump is really desperately hoping to find a ramp off this and not go for a full-on blown conflict, because it's very clear to him that achieving the goal of removing the Iranian regime or completely obliterating the Iranian nuclear plan, that's an almost unachievable goal.
Trump is threatening that this will be the final round of talks. What's at stake for Iran and the wider region here?
I think, Iran has been trying to say, this is not just about us. We have still our proxies. We still have, our power, a way to make this go beyond just, and they also already said clearly any attack is an attack. So even if it's a limited attack, this is an act of aggression. We will respond with full force, which could deteriorate to an all-out war, bringing the Iraqi militias supporting the Iranis. Of course, Lebanon and Hezbollah. You have the Houthis in Yemen. This all upheaval is something that some of America's closest allies in the Gulf are very much afraid of, and this is also one of the reasons that the Americans are very hesitant. I think we're not there yet. I think this day would be a very crucial day. We also need to see Rubio will be in Israel tomorrow. It seems like both sides want to find a solution, but at the same time, the red lines that they are both setting are so far from each other that it's really hard to see how there's any peaceful solution for all of this.
All eyes on Geneva again. DW's Middle East analyst Shani Razanis. Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Anthony.
With me now is Ellie Garan-Meyer, Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Ellie, I'm curious, from a European perspective, in this particular context, is gunboat diplomacy an effective or extremely risky tactic to reach resolution?
Well, look, I think from a European stance, it is an extremely risky position to be going down, because Tehran and Washington, if they can't make a breakthrough today in some of the key red line issues that both sides have flawed, we may be sleepwalking into a new military conflict in the Middle East, perhaps bigger than anything we've seen in the last 15 years in this part of the world. And of course, Iran is in a region very close to Europe, and that has direct repercussions for European security.
Iran has told the UN that it will respond decisively and proportionately to any U.S. strike. Is there any way Europe can help prevent this from becoming a broader conflict?
Look, unfortunately and sadly, as someone who's worked on this issue for, many years, Europeans are very much absent in this game at the moment, both on the diplomatic front. There is no longer an E3 plus framework for negotiations with Iran. And they are also absent in de-escalation, providing off-ramps against military conflict. And we've seen this role now being taken up by countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. But what Europeans can, and I think should be doing, is aligning themselves with their partners in the region, like these three that I've just named, to try and at least manage any military outfall that may come from US strikes. We don't know what type of US strikes could be ordered by President Trump if a diplomatic breakthrough is not made, but there are certainly guardrails that can be put by Europe and the regional countries to prevent this from becoming a broader conflict that affects them all.
As I'm sure you are well aware, we're seeing a growing list of countries urging their citizens to leave Iran immediately. What does this signal about how governments, especially governments in Europe, see the risk of imminent conflict?
But look, everyone was caught by surprise in June when, in the middle of US-Iran negotiation, Israel mounted a surprise attack against Iran, which became that 12-day war. During that moment, many European citizens were basically trapped inside Iran because the airspace remained closed. It was very difficult to get to the borders to leave. So I think European countries are being diligent in this effort to urge citizens to leave Iran. Potentially, this may broaden into Israel if there's an assessment that Iran will strike missiles, retaliatory missiles into Israel. And we've also seen the US now advise against advising to downsize their embassies in some parts of the region, fearing a counterstrike from Iran.
If the Geneva round fails to produce a breakthrough, what does Europe see most likely to happen? A limited U.S. strike on nuclear or missile sites, or a broader confrontation that could pull in Iran's regional allies?
Look, I think the only person that can answer that question is President Trump. And it's not clear that Trump himself knows what the answer to that question is. And part of the problem at the moment with answering your question is that there's no clarity where the US end goals for a military strike are. One day it's to get Iran to negotiate on a nuclear program, which US President himself has repeatedly said was obliterated, apparently no longer. And another day it's to help Iranians on the ground to reclaim their institutions amid protests. But that issue on human rights and protesters in Iran seems to now have been completely sidelined in these negotiations. And increasingly now, US officials are talking about Iran's missiles, and basically setting those capabilities back is the end goal. So it's all over the place at the moment in terms of objectives. And that means right now what we do know is that the US military has provided the president with a wide range of options of what type of strikes could be conducted. I think that the European position is likely to be, if the US is going in for strikes, to keep this as restricted and basically contained as possible, to targeting those Iranian capabilities that are of greatest risk to global security, which is essentially its nuclear capabilities, but also its missile capabilities that are growing. But I think that everyone is calculating on there being quite a major Iranian retaliation, no matter what type of strike the US conducts.
Our thanks to you, Eli Gerenmaya, Deputy Director, the European Council on Foreign Relations. Many thanks.